I would like to start and open with a moment of silence, honoring those racialized people and their allies, both past and present, who have lost their lives as a consequence of and in the struggle against systemic oppression. Thank you all. Welcome to our virtual Gallier Gathering. For those of you who are new, welcome, but for those of you who are returning, glad to see you here joining us. I am Dr. Anastasia Scott. I have the title of Director of Educational Programming here at Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. Gallier Gatherings are being offered to you for free in this virtual platform. If you like our programming, please become a member. Membership has its perks. If you are not a Louisiana or New Orleans resident, you can take advantage of the North American Reciprocal Museum Association, where you can receive reciprocal membership benefits with museums and cultural institutions across the United States, Canada, Bermuda, El Salvador, and Mexico. Membership also helps with sponsoring programs such as this. If you join now, the membership is good through the end of June 2021. If you are impacted by COVID-19, we are offering student membership for $25 a year. The Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses preserve and present the architecture and history of New Orleans from 19th century through the mid-20th century. We aim to be the best example of and practices of stewardship, both in architectural preservation and in inclusive education. We continually expand our interpretation of both houses, including the lives of the enslaved people who lived and worked in the houses. Our engaging programming for both youth and adults inspires an interest in the preservation for the future. At any given time, between 1831 and 1865, there were more people of African descent living and working in the houses than people of European descent. Because of this, we are intentional about expanding discussions of the lives of the enslaved people and related topics. For this talk, Finding Isabelle, my Belle London Jefferson, a New Orleans family matriarch, Mrs. Gaynell Brady will examine African-American genealogy through the lens of the Greens, Meyers, and Jefferson families, who lived in Clinton, des Allemands, and New Orleans, Louisiana. Gaynell Brady earned a BA in history and an MA in museum studies from Southern University at New Orleans. Gaynell is currently a Ph.D. candidate at Capella University in Minneapolis, Minnesota, working on her dissertation that includes teaching and interpreting slavery to students. Gaynell is a local museum professional who has served as an education program consultant and curator at the Louisiana State Museum and an interpretive park ranger for the National Park Service. Gaynell's passion for history and genealogy is expounded through her company, Our Mammies, where she provides interactive history and genealogy lessons for children and families. She has spent the last 7 years teaching and interpreting the lives of African Americans in Louisiana. Gaynell has lectured at cultural institutions, libraries, and museum conferences. When she is not teaching or researching, Gaynell is traveling Louisiana's highways and byways and spending time with her family. A little housekeeping before we begin. If you notice the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A chat feature or a Q&A feature where you can submit your questions. For the logistics of this program, Miss Gaynell will be lecturing for 1 hour. But if you have questions throughout this period, we ask that you use the Q&A chat feature as opposed to the Q&A feature as opposed to the chat, so that, for example, if you all have any overlapping questions, then you can simply like a question that's similar to what you would have asked, and you can upvote for the next question to be asked. That would be the most efficient way, but you can submit your questions throughout the entirety of her 1 hour lecture, so that we have that compiled at the end. So we will be asking questions at the end, but when you do have questions throughout Miss Brady's lecture, could you please submit it to the Q&A feature? So without further ado, I present to you Mrs. Gaynell Brady.
Okay. One moment, y'all. Sorry about that, everyone. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. I had to wonder who you were talking about at first until I heard you say my name. But it's an honor to present on my Belle. She is one of my heroes. I carry her around with me every day, both in my heart and a photo of her. If you know me, I do talk about her well. She's like one of my role models, and so let's get into it. So what I want to do is try my best to give you a brief introduction to African-American genealogy, but using my Belle and her story as a way to simplify the process to you. Of course, I can't cover everything within this 1 hour, but I will do my very best to share with you as much as you need to get started if you want to focus on one person in your family. So as a genealogist, there are certain tools that you need to get started. You definitely need some type of device to record voices, whether it's the recorder app on your phone or just a standalone recorder. Something to write with, something to keep notes, some type of scanner. You can use your cell phone for that as well. A camera to take photos, and any type of binders or folders that you want to use to organize your research. All of these things have been really helpful to me, especially in certain situations where information came about in weird ways. For example, I went to a cemetery once in a small town in Louisiana, and they didn't have any names on any of the grave markers, but I met this guy there, and he actually assisted with some of the burials. So he was able to walk me from gravesite to gravesite, telling me who was buried in each section. And I was able, because I had a notepad and a camera and everything on me, I was able to fully document that particular section of the cemetery. So when I started working on my Belle, there are some things that you need to know in terms of like where to look and what documents are available. And then everything that you find, you need to make sure that you're documenting everything. One of the easiest things to do is to create a timeline on that person's life. Once you figure out when they were born and when they died, just kind of like put a rough timeline in there to make sure that you have documentation pretty much covering every decade that they were alive. It'll what were they doing? Where were they working? It kind of helps you to keep all of that information together and organized in chronological order. So another thing that you want to do as you're researching, you want to have some type of research log. Make a list of every source you use to research your ancestors, and be sure to cite your sources. I wouldn't tell you, I can't believe how many times I have researched the same thing and it appeared brand new to me in the beginning because I wasn't properly documenting where I found that information, or sometimes when I needed to prove that I've done like a reasonably exhaustive search, that, oh, I've actually checked every single document that I possibly could during this time period on this particular ancestor. So that's where like your binder system comes into place, unless you're scanning and uploading stuff onto a Google Drive or a flash drive of some sort. Just keeping a research log on the people that you research and cite your sources. So I'm not sure if you can see this and how clear it is, but on familysearch.org, there's a free research log that you can download and print and keep, or you can create your own version if you prefer to use Excel spreadsheet. But just kind of like, as long as it has like your ancestors' names on there, what you're looking for, what's the research question you're answering, where it's located, the date that you searched, and any other identifying information. So if you need to go back to that document to check anything, then you'll have that information readily available. If you're using places like Ancestry.com,
Hi, Gaynell. I apologize. Everyone, we do want to acknowledge that there's a break in we lose sound. So I guess be patient with us when we lose sound. And Gaynell, I'll just acknowledge when you lose sound, and then we'll do a sound check throughout the.
And that's fine. Yeah, I can repeat if they need me to. If you bring it to my attention, I can.
Okay, so yeah, you just came back, so I guess start this slide over. Not the slide, but the narrative.
Okay, so this photo is the reason I got started with our mammies and just wanted to know more about who this lady was. I could find this photo in like everyone's household in my family. Like everybody had a copy of this particular photo. I didn't really know who this lady was, other than all I know is that that's Mama Belle. And I heard stories about her cooking and baking goods and just how many people she raised. She raised her siblings. She raised her own kids. She raised my grandmother, and she raised some of my grandmother's children. So to hear all of these stories, it's like, who is this lady?
Okay, Gaynell. So, you know, it's not a big deal. Technology fails us. So we just ask that throughout this presentation that you all be patient with us.
In my Belle's case, it was on the walls.
Gaynell,
Yes, ma'am.
You lost sound. So after you mentioned who was this woman, she raised a whole bunch of people. Can you start from there? And again, we apologize. Sorry, you all, but technology fails us at certain points. So when she loses sound, I'll just tell her to start back over. Now, thank you all for your patience in advance.
And I can try something else on my end as well.
Okay. Thank you all for your patience. Gaynell, just let us know when you're ready. Okay. Thank you for your suggestions. So, Catherine said it might help if she tried.
Is this better, Anastasia?
Yes, that is better.
Okay, awesome. I just switched microphones.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm going to share my screen now. Okay.
Thank you all.
Okay, is this better, everybody?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'll start over again. This particular photo of my ancestor was hanging around in everyone's house. You can find it on walls and photo albums and Bibles. And you would hear so many stories about her cooking and her baking goods and just raising so many generations. The fact that this particular woman that I only knew of at that time, I only knew of her as my Belle. I knew that she raised her siblings. I heard that she raised her own kids. She helped raise my grandmother and then some of my grandmother's children as well. But the only thing I knew was just that that's my Belle. And everybody had this wonderful story about her. I would see her photo everywhere. And so that's how I got started with just genealogy, just our mammies in itself. Like after learning so much about her and other women like her, I started this company to honor their memory.
Lost sound. Gaynell, did you start this slide yet? Did you start narrating this one?
That I can find on her, and then not only that, just cross-checking whatever I heard. So I started interviewing all of my relatives, and there's a photo of my mom and her siblings who are descendants of my Belle. They're her great-granddaughters. And so I started questioning them more and more and more about my Belle, just so that I can learn everything I can about her. My mom would tell me about my Belle's recipes in terms of like when she cooked red beans and okra. It's just a very weird combination. You have to adapt to it. And then my auntie Brenda, you would see her as one of our like gatekeepers. She was one of the ones who always, she has on a black skirt, she always kept photos of like family programs and just obituaries and any other records that related to the family history, so that I know I can always call her and pick on her for questions. So I started by talking to them. And then as I went on, I was just talking to anyone who knew anything about my Belle in terms of like people in the neighborhood where she grew up. So the next thing that you could do, you try to, if you're researching someone, you try to find someone living or one of her immediate descendants. So in my Belle's case, her spouse, Alex, who was born in 1885, he died in 1971, the same year that my Belle died. So I didn't have Grandpa Alex to talk to. So my Mary had a daughter living, and this is one of the reasons why I want more and more younger people to get involved into genealogy, is because my Belle's had a daughter living during my time period. My Mary was lived right in the same neighborhood where my Belle pretty much raised everybody, as I say. But I didn't know who my Mary was, other than the fact that everybody called her my Mary. Again, I didn't understand how this person was related to me, but I knew it was somebody that everyone looked up to. Little did I know that that was my great-grandmother's sister. So if I would have known what I know now, I would have spent more time with my Mary, just questioning her about my grandma Florence, because she died when my mom was just a couple of years old, and my mom actually shares her name. In fact, I was supposed to be Florence as well, but my mom decided that was the end of the Florence saga. So my Belle actually had several kids. She had 4 kids, 3 girls and 1 boy. All of them were long gone with the exception of my Mary. So that's another reason why it's important, especially in these times, to spend time talking to your kids and your grandkids about your family history and documenting your own story, so that we'll be able to share it with the younger generation in case there are questions or things that they need to know. We'll be able to share that with them while we all still remember. Another thing that I would also like to remind you of, now is the perfect time to start a journal or start documenting your own life story. As genealogists, we often forget to do that. I still haven't really taken the time to document my experiences during Hurricane Katrina. So that's something that I'm going to spend some time doing next week, in fact. So the next thing that you can do when you are done interviewing folks, you can start to look for their obituaries. Obituaries in really large cities like New Orleans and such, and then also in some of the small towns as well, they're fairly easy to find. You can find these obituaries in your public libraries. You can find them online through places like genealogybank.com, and just search for their information, just pretty much what you know on them and what you learn from them from, excuse me, from interviews. The important thing that you want to know about obituaries is to take your time, read through the obituaries, gather the name of any of the children, any spouses, any relatives, sister-in-laws, mother-in-laws, brother-in-laws, whatever you can, where they worked, where they're buried. The obituaries contain so much information, and it kind of hurts my heart today when you look at the obituary, people are not as detailed as they once were. So in this case, I noticed that my Belle, they didn't really say her maiden name in here. They did mention her parents as John and Sarah Meyers. They mentioned her daughter, as you can see, Mary, and her other kids, and my grandma Florence. One thing I want you to notice, towards the middle of her obituary, you see the name Thomas London of Scotlandville. That was a clue that I overlooked until I ended up talking to my Uncle Clay, which is one of my mom's youngest brothers. That's why I tell you to take the time to really read through the obituaries. And if you notice, my Belle's husband, Alex Jefferson, died the same year that she died, only a couple of months apart. To my understanding, and just like everything that I feel inside of me, I just feel like Grandpa Alex died of a broken heart, simply because he and my Belle were together since they were about 16 years old. So I can just imagine what he felt like, you know, not having her in his life. So the next thing that you can do is look for vital records such as birth certificates, death certificates, and marriage certificates. The Secretary of State in Louisiana has an online index of vital records where you can actually search for any death certificates that are 50 years or older. You can do this online, and if I forgot to mention, everyone who has registered for this presentation will receive a resource guide with the links to all of these websites that I'm talking about. So you don't have to worry about trying to write down all of these web addresses and all of these sites. So as I said, you can get archived death certificates for anything that's 50 years or older. They also have some, they have indexes for marriages in Louisiana. If you need something that's not exactly 50 years old or something that's 50 years or less, you have to go to the Office of Vital Records. Same thing for birth records. Their birth records were not actually required until 1918. So you can't really find a birth certificate for someone in Louisiana before 1917. It's not a guarantee. It's just, they were not required. And you can see online also, if you're looking for a different state, that those birth certificates were not required. There are some places where you can find records through maybe the archdiocese, through baptisms and such, where you can verify the birth. But the actual birth certificates were not required in Louisiana until 1918. Okay, so the next step, if you want to dig a little deeper into this person's life, you can look at the cemetery. According to that obituary, my Belle was buried at Holt's Cemetery in New Orleans. Holt Cemetery is owned by the city of New Orleans, and I did reach out to them because if you've ever been to Holt, it's not really easy to navigate. Over the past few years, things have gotten a lot better. It's a lot easier to walk through. But if you are trying to identify a grave location in Holt and you don't have like the number or the grave number, you're going to have a difficult time. But in some other organized cemeteries, you can reach out to that cemetery and see if there's an actual grave marker for your ancestor there. In my case, none of my ancestors that are buried in Holt Cemetery actually have a grave marker. And that's one of the other missions of my organization, to try to purchase grave markers for all of my ancestors, especially the ones who are in the city without any markers of their graves. But it's a great place to go. For example, there are some small cemeteries that are held by local churches that are next door to the churches, whereas they may not have information online, but when you actually visit the cemetery, you'll actually see a grave marker with birth and death information. Especially when you're dealing with enslaved sites. Sometimes, depending on how well they're kept up, you may or may not find a grave marker with information on there, but you may find that neighbor that knows everything about that cemetery. Another place you can check is the church history, any family or marriage programs and baptism and christening records. So the photo that you're looking at is of Second Nazareth Baptist Church. When my Belle and her siblings came down to New Orleans, her stepfather, as I come to learn, actually founded Nazareth, or is now known Second Nazareth Baptist Church. Excuse me. Those two markers on there, when I walked up to that church, they actually bear the name of my Belle's husband, Alex Jefferson, as one of the deacons there. My family has been a part of Nazareth Baptist Church from the very beginning of time, when the church was first founded in Des Allemands, Louisiana. It was organized by John Meyers, who was my Belle's stepfather, in 1920 in Des Allemands. So I have roots to that area. In fact, through my grandmother, her father was actually from that area. And so that's a photo of Pastor John Meyers that's hanging, well, it was hanging in the church. Right now, to my understanding, there's a possibility the church may be torn down due to physical damage to the building. So in 1925, what I learned from the church records, the family came down to New Orleans. So in terms of my Belle's life, when I'm looking for records, I know for a fact that I can find my Belle living in Lafourche Parish in the early 1900s. But after 1925, when the church moved to New Orleans, I know that I would have to look for my Belle in New Orleans. So if your family was a part of a church from the beginning of time, look at those church records so that you could kind of get an idea of when and where your family moved about, if that church moved about, because we all know that we tend to live near the places of work that we worship. So in the case of Second Nazareth, I can see that it was originally at 516 Amelia Street and then eventually moved to Nazareth Street. And my Belle didn't live too far from this community. So another place that you can go when you're looking for African American
Thank you all for your patience. Gaynell, we've been on a roll, so we've lost sound again. So just simply start this slide over when we get
after.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you start this one over? You're back on now.
You're back on. Okay. So another place that you can look for records is your local university. So if there's any universities around the city where your ancestors lived, you can look into those universities for records. So Xavier University, Dillard University, all of these universities have huge archives of information on African Americans. In my case, I ended up looking at Tulane University Amistad Research Center. So after Reverend Meyers died, Reverend James Young took over. When Reverend Young passed away, his family took his entire collection and donated it to Tulane University. So inside this collection, I was able to find photos, diaries, books, and just any kind of pamphlets and stuff on Second Nazareth Baptist Church. And I was so shocked to see this at Tulane University. It was fairly easy to find using just the finding aids. I just typed in Reverend Young's name, and by chance, he came up. And it just blew me away when I put my hands on that box. And I remember getting photos from the university and sharing it with my aunt and some of the other church members. So I want to encourage you to reach out to the local universities, check out their websites, and search through their digital content and see if they're holding any of your family's history. I know Dr. Antoinette Harrell often does presentations on kind of creating your own collection. Once you've done all of this research, once you've done all this genealogy stuff, you have to find a way to share it with other people. And this is certainly one of the ways that we can do that. So another thing that you can also look at is military records. So in my Belle's case, she didn't participate in World War I or any of the major wars, but as you can see, I can pretty much document her life based on Alex's military records. So you can see my Belle. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I was saying you were breaking up, but you're back on now. Did you move to the next slide, or is this
I'm on the next slide?
On Amistad? Okay, can you? It's not appearing. It's still saying universities.
Okay. Are we there yet?
Well, we're still on Amistad Research Center finding aids.
And let me know when I switch over.
Oh, okay. You still have it.
Did it switch?
Oh.
It's not working? Let me try this.
Okay, so oh, I see. Thank you all. I'm on the chat. So it's me and not everyone else. So thank you all. So I'm not gonna, I can still follow. So, well, thank you all for that. You all are, look, participatory audience. I appreciate you all. So it's just me. It seems as though everyone.
You're breaking up.
We're good to go. So you can just continue, and
okay.
I'll just let you know when it's time, and then we can do the back.
Okay, so I'll continue. Let me know if you guys can still hear me. Okay, so in the case of my Belle, I know that she didn't participate in any of the world wars, but her I did find information on my Belle through her husband Alex. And so one thing I wanted to point out to you, we can see her name here as the nearest relative, so that kind of confirms, like, yeah, that was his wife. Great. I also see that Grandpa Alex worked at Blue Lumber Yard in Des Allemands, or as my grandma called it, Bayou Zelma. They have his birthday, January 2nd, so that all checked out. But then you also, if you look to this section here, we can actually see that Grandpa Alex's arm was off at the elbow, and his left hand was gone except for the thumb. And I actually heard this from my mom and then other relatives that Grandpa Alex was actually injured at the sawmill. That's where he lost his right arm and his left hand, except for his thumb. But I did heard that Grandpa Alex, nevertheless, in spite of all of this, was able to put his hands on you if he had to. And so here again, we see with his World War II draft registration card, Grandpa Alex and my Belle were living on Chapatula Street. They were born in Clinton, Louisiana. All of that checks out. And then you see that the name of his nearest person is Belle Jefferson. Now, one thing I do want to point out to you, when it comes to genealogy, don't stress out over the spellings of names, because sometimes you'll see Alexander, Alex. It's going to be spelled all different kinds of way. The handwriting is not going to be what we're accustomed to looking at today, but just be mindful of all that as you're doing your searches. That please do so. Okay, so when you're dealing with the census, try to search by name and approximate dates. Document any information that you found and make sure you're double checking everything. Note that the census is released every 72 years. And the records from the 1950 census will be released sometime this year. Sometime in 2022. I may have messed that up. But anyway, just to let you guys know that it comes out every 72 years. The one that we're filling out now, none of us will be alive to see the results of it, unless we order the one that's specifically on us. But I do want to emphasize how important it is to complete it. Starting in 1870, the census started listing the names of all African Americans. The 1890 census was destroyed in a fire in 1821. They only recovered about 1% of that. So if you're looking for your ancestor on the 1890 census, as you can tell based on the numbers, there's a slim chance that you'll find them on there. Prior to 1860, free people of color were listed on the census. Not any of my ancestors prior to 1870 that I could actually find on there who were enslaved. My ancestors who I connect with through DNA and through some other things happening, I was able to identify them. So I started with the 1940 census, and I knew that was the easiest one that you can actually find your ancestors on. In this case, as you can see right here, there's my Belle Jefferson living with her husband, Alex, and they're living on Chapatula Street. I can see that they're also living in New Orleans on the 12th ward, in the 12th ward. I knew for the most part, my mom's family lived in the 12th ward until my grandma got married, and then she moved to the 9th ward where I was born and raised. So that covered me with my Belle on the 1940 census. I also see in 1940 that my Belle was a cook for a private family. I can also see that she, for the most part, was the breadwinner. That Grandpa Alex, I guess because of his injuries or just because of time, just retired. So she was a breadwinner for her household. And I can see that from this column here, cook, private family, and there's nothing for Grandpa Alex. Excuse me. Same thing with the 1930 census. I can see Grandpa Alex, and then there goes Grandma, my Belle. And as you can tell on this census, her name is called Isabelle. So then we have Belle, we have Isabelle, but to my family and to everyone around her, she was just known as my Belle. One thing that I do want you to pay attention to as you're dealing with African-American genealogy, especially pay attention to the neighbors, people who live next door to them, people who are a couple of pages before or after. And it's simply because we have a habit of staying close together. We tend to live next door to each other. For example, my family in Lower Ninth Ward, I pretty much have a cousin or a relative with on and we knew that my Belle and Grandpa Alex were active in the church. So in this particular case, we see Lafourche Parish in the 7th Ward. There's John Meyer. Notice the name spelling. The name switched over again, but there's his wife, Sarah, right next door or within the same household. We see Alex Jefferson. There goes my Belle's daughter, Cornelius. That's her husband. And this is my Belle's daughter, Mary. All of them living within the same area, living and working together. When we lean over and we see Alex's occupation, we see sawmill. So all of that checks out. It also supports what I've learned from just my grandmother and learning that she was born in Bayou Zelma, which was called Des Allemands. In 1910, they were over in East Feliciana Parish. So in this case, we see Alex and Belle Jefferson here. We see them with the kids, and then also see John Myers and Sarah a little bit above them. So that lists all of them. One thing I kind of want you to see is if you notice the children on here, it lists all of the kids, and that was kind of checked out through the obituaries and just things that I've learned about the family. All of John Myers' kids were involved in the church. In fact, the women of that church worked together to buy that building on 2nd Street. They were the ones who were responsible for raising the funds so that they can purchase the building to give their dad church. So we have them again on the 1900 census. And as you work and work back, sometimes these things can become very faded. And I'm sorry that I have to lean in to see, but you notice the Jefferson family here. We also notice that on this particular census, we can see that there are some other siblings listed in Sarah's household. Outside of the census, you can also search the local directories. So in this case, I found this actually on ancestry.com. It shows that, yes. Okay. It shows that Belle Jefferson was living with her husband, Alex, in 1945 on Chapatula Street. It also shows the address. So I can actually drive to Chapatula Street and see that building. For some reason, it was spelled weird, but if you're from New Orleans, you know how to spell Chapatulas. I don't know what happened here with the translation or whatever. And that's the weird part about when we look at how things are transcribed. Sometimes they don't transcribe them correctly. So make sure that you click in and look at every document and view it for yourself. So in this particular case, I see that my Belle was working at Mother's Homemade Pies. And it shows her address on Chapatula. So it made me want to learn more about Mother's Homemade Pies. I knew from just oral history that my family members on my mom's side, they were all bakers. They can all bake. They were all part of a union. In fact, on Grandma Florence's obituary, it shows that she was in a union for bakers. So I started looking up mother's homemade pies. I did that by searching newspapers. And that's the thing when you're dealing with African-American history, it is so important to look at newspapers. When you listen to all of the expert genealogists on African-American history, they're going to emphasize to you how important it is to search for your ancestors in the newspaper. And you were going to find the good, the bad, the ugly in a newspaper. I mean, I found an article on my grandmother who burned to death up on Jenner Street in the newspaper. It wasn't on this particular side of the family, but it did happen. So as I was looking for a mother's homemade pies, I learned that it was owned by Mr. Ben Perkowski from Poland, and he actually came to the United States in World War I. And one would ask, why in the world would you look up Mr. Ben's information? Well, when you're dealing with African-American genealogy, it's important not only to research your family history, but any of the families that's associated with your family. So it's especially important when you're dealing with enslaved people and you think that you have a lead. It's very important for you to know their history as well as you know your own, because it'll help you find your family later. Excuse me, I'm gonna get a drink of water. And another place that I want to talk to you about is museums. And I'm going to invite some of my guest speakers to talk to you about their particular institutions.
Been having some issues. So can you hear me before
I can hear you. You're just breaking up just a little bit.
Okay. I'll just, the Whitney Plantation. So I will let the Whitney Plantation start and then I'll go back.
Okay, I think we've lost Anastasia for a little bit, but so I'll introduce myself. My name is Ashley, and I'm from the Whitney Plantation. I'm the executive director, and we are a plantation site that's in St. John the Baptist Parish. We have, we're a site that is exclusively dedicated to education about the history of slavery and African American history. And for this particular discussion, I think that one thing that a lot of people don't know about Whitney, so we're well known for our tours that we offer about slavery and the memorials that we have there, but Whitney Plantation was actually a working sugarcane plantation until 1975. Wow. And there were resident cane workers that lived on site for the duration of that time. And so we've done a lot of research actually about the period after slavery, and we have a large database internally of people who worked at Whitney Plantation in the 20th century. So we have about 450 names of people who were working there as employees from about 1940 through the end 1975. And through those post-slavery labor records, we've been able to trace some families back to slavery because, of course, a lot of the people that were working on Whitney Plantation as resident cane workers in the 20th century were actually direct descendants of people who had been enslaved on the site. And so that is something that we don't have currently publicly available, but it is available to research requests. And we have, like I said, pretty well documented names throughout and can help to kind of trace some people back. This is especially helpful because if you're looking for ancestors in the New Orleans area, a lot of people who ended up in places like the 9th Ward and the 7th Ward actually have ancestry in the parishes outside of the city. So we know we've been able to document some families that we know moved into the city, and we have kind of that earlier, we have that like earlier connection. So that's what I'll say about the resources that we have available at Whitney Plantation. We also have a full-time researcher and research assistant who help us with some of these projects at Whitney.
Thank you. Gaynell, can you hear me? I'll just need the panelists to verify for me. Can you hear me? I'll go very quickly while I have this stability. So because of the lack of personal records left by the enslaved Africans in the antebellum New Orleans, archive Sacramento records, tax records, and census reports, as Gaynell has been going over, can be used to create sort of a whole picture of, for us in particular, the enslaved Africans that resided on the property. Mm-hmm. And so using the family's records, so mm-hmm. we have the Galliers, the Hermans, and the Grimas, we can go through their records to craft what life would have looked like. Mm-hmm. And so we are currently, we have records of the bios of the families, the Creole families, but we also have a database of the enslaved that lived on both properties. And so we are working internally on a public-facing resource, one that would be a family tree of the Creole families, but the other would be an interactive timeline of the enslaved. So we're sort of working on that internally, but in the near future, we will have a public-facing resource for the family tree and a timeline, a detailed timeline.
So as you can tell, just from hearing from just two institutions, that there's like a plethora of information available at your local museums. And especially in these times, it's so important to support all of our cultural institutions. Inside of that resource guide, I did my very best to list out as many African-American museums and cultural sites that I can that you can visit or contact, especially during these times. You're going to really need your support. I encourage you to travel on the River Road and visit some of these places, to travel to the places where your stories may live. I can tell you of a particular incident when I went to visit the West Baton Rouge Museum, and I was visiting the plantation store there, and I can't explain to you the feeling that you get when you see a piece of your family's story of the homemade plies location on Magazine Street. It gave me a little glimpse of what this time would have looked like, and that's the beauty of museums. They're the people that collect the things that can tell us more about the stories of the people of a community, the places, and all of the spaces that our families worked and lived. So it was really cool to find this photo at the Historic New Orleans Collection, and I found this online, of the building, which is now the local hardware store, Ace Hardware. So I encourage you to search online, see if there's anything in their digital libraries, but also once all of this pandemic stuff is over, go out and visit these places and give them their support. Become a member and support any and all of the cultural institutions where your families come from. And just to tie into that, I would also encourage you to visit the places where your ancestors came from. So my mom and I took the trip to Bayou Zama to get an idea of the land where my grandmother was born and raised, and to also check out the living environment. It was beautiful. I love Louisiana. Louisiana has so many wonderful, beautiful landscapes. Get out there on the road, take your family with you, and document what you see. I actually went to Clinton, Louisiana And this is where all the courthouse and Lawyers Row. So I walked the town here in just peaceful, quiet, excuse me, one Saturday. I took my family there and we drove through the town of Clinton. I really wanted to have an idea of where my ancestors came from, and there's nothing like putting your feet on the soil where your ancestors come from. And I say this as a person who has stepped on the land where my ancestors were enslaved, with my children, and just having conversations with my children about what it was like to be out in this open field handling cotton for years, for generations, multiple generations. As you heard Ashley say earlier, our families didn't really move too far from where they were once enslaved. But in my case, with my Belle's case, you can see, excuse me, this family traveled. And it wasn't until I had a conversation with my mom that I started to understand why. On this side of my family, they traveled because they were seeking better opportunities for each generation that came before them. My mom would often say she wanted my brother and I, my sister, to be way better than what she was. And she made certain of it. She bought us encyclopedias. So as form of punishment, when we were locked inside, my brother and I, we actually read encyclopedias. We had no choice. We couldn't say we didn't have resources. They made those investments. They spent time with us. And it was all of that, but just to make sure that we were well-rounded kids. I also went to the sawmill because I wanted to see some of the tools that my grandpa Alex would have worked with. So there's a Cypress Sawmill Museum in Patterson, Louisiana. So my family and I packed up the car, threw some sandwiches in the car, and we drove down to Patterson, Louisiana to see the sawmill there. And I encourage you to do the same. Once you figure out where your ancestors come from, get out, get on the road, check out the lands where they come from. So I want to skip through this slide of my Belle's house because I only have a little bit more time. And I wanted to cover a few more things with you. So this is pretty much my tree, starting from my grandmother Delilah and all of her children. Yes, my mom is one of 16. And I just worked my way back. So as you can see, you see Mama Belle right here with Alex. There's her mom, Sarah. And then my Uncle Clay, when I was talking about my Belle, he told me, he said, Gaynell, Mama Belle was not a Meyers. She was a London. Excuse me, I said, a London? Where you get that from? He said, I'm telling you. My mama would say, they said that my Belle was not John Meyers' daughter. She, in fact, had a different dad. So I started on that track. I started working on my Belle's line. I opened it up a little bit. And as you can see, Sarah, she identified her parents. And then also Sarah's parents are Jesse and Sally Robbins. But that thing about my Belle being a London kind of stayed with me. So I would say maybe it was about a year ago or a little over a year ago. I won a DNA test. And I actually took the DNA test. And when my results first came back, they told me that I was 51% Nigerian and all of the rest of the stuff had small percentages. But anyone who has taken a DNA test, especially through Ancestry, will tell you that those numbers are going to shift so much as more and more people test. But when I first came out, I actually, I enjoyed my results. I actually picked on my coworkers, especially my buddy Jim, about raising the British flag, because at one point it was saying that I was like 10% British. I was like, you got to raise the British flag before the American flag. Just joking with him. And you just got to know how Jim and I get along to know how funny that was. But I looked at those countries and I kind of like saw the estimates, but I wasn't so concerned with ethnicity, to be honest with you. As a person who looks at my enslaved ancestors so much, honestly, guys, I just wanted to connect the people. So in my case, as it relates to my
Gaynell, can you go back to the beginning of this slide? We lost audio.
shared matches to figure out who Shad was and how was I related to him, and if it was possible, if he was related to my Belle. So I did the little lookup, and it turns out that Shad is a descendant of my Belle's brother, Thomas. And of course, Thomas's dad was Thomas London, and that's also my Belle's father. So it felt really good to know that, yay, so my Belle was a London. When my Uncle Clay told me, of course I believed them, but as genealogists, we want to make sure what we have is right. So I actually went through and I started digging up more and more information on the London family, because I wanted to know more about this. This man is, you know, now one of my grandfathers. I want to know who he is. And it turns out one of Thomas London Jr.'s sons, Henry London, who's photoed here with his family, was involved in the Baton Rouge bus boycott. He owned a bus company in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So when I found these photos of him and someone shared the story to me about Scotlandville, all I can do was just look to the sky and say, my Belle, like, did you see what your nephew did? Like, this is so amazing to learn that a piece of me, a piece of my family was involved with the civil rights movement in Baton Rouge. So something else someone shared with me, and just through speaking, but I haven't verified it yet. I was told that based on what they heard, that my Belle's family was actually owned by the Robbins family at one point in time in East Feliciana family in Parish. So I started digging on this Robbins family, and it turns out I found a will from Thomas Jefferson Robbins. Now I knew that my Belle's great-grandmother was Sally Robbins and her husband was Jesse Robbins. I knew that in the ward where my Belle's family was living. As you can tell, they had the whole family valued at $1,900. Jesse at $500, Sally at $450, George at $100, Leah at $500, Millie at $200, and Polly at $150. So where I am now is trying to find any records for Millie and Leah and George to see if I match DNA for any of their descendants so that I can prove that, in fact, this is my family. But I have to confess to you guys, when I saw this will, I broke down. A piece of me just shattered because the way that they described the people in this will, they made them sound like nothing. They made them sound like property. So the last thing that I want to share with you, and this is my first time sharing it with anyone outside of my family, is I did a presentation on my Belle, I think it was last year. So at the end of the presentation, people came up to me, and in particular, this one guy came up to me, and he said, you know, I find it a coincidence that you're talking about a Belle Jefferson, and my mom died talking about a Belle Jefferson who took care of his family. And I said, oh, really? And he said, like, all the information that you talked about, the neighborhood that you talked about, all of that stuff matches. And so that was that was about 3 years ago when he brought that up to me. So I did the presentation last year, and he brought it up to me again, like, Gaynell, we need to do something. We need to figure this out. So finally, he and I connected, and I shared with him the photographs, the two on the right, which is this one and that one. I shared with him those photographs, and he had this one. And he said, I believe the lady featured in this photograph is your grandma, my Belle. And he said, we just need to prove it. So this gentleman, and I don't want to mention his name, he said, I'm going to send it off for forensics. And he did. So I'm going to attempt to show the results with you guys. And Anastasia, I'm going to need your help to make sure that my video plays.
Okay.
It's on?
Yeah, it's on.
Awesome. So you guys take a look. This is him comparing my Belle's photo, the one that I gave him, to the one that he had.
Ashley, if you want, can you hop in? I wouldn't be a good person to determine if the video is on. Could you confirm?
It was frozen a little bit, but it looks like it might be starting right now.
Thank you, Ashley.
Oh yeah, it's going.
It off, and he paid just a few dollars to have it analyzed, and the results came back. In fact, based on the photographs that we have, this lady is one and the same. So that he actually had a photo of my Belle, one that my family didn't have at all. And so my question to him was, where did my Belle get that fur coat from? Because she wouldn't have had the money to buy it. And he said that fur coat once belonged to to his grandmother.
Wow.
So I encourage you to share the stories of your ancestors. Don't just research them and put them in a book. Research them and share them. You never know who you're going to meet, who you're going to inspire, and just how you're going to reach back and inspire yourself. That's why I don't travel without my Belle's photograph. I often joke around with my husband and I tell him, I've already picked out my grandma nickname. He's like, what? I was like, he's like, you're not a grandma. I was like, I want to be called Mama now. And it's simply because all of the powerful women in my family were known as Mama. You had to earn that title. Like I said, my Mary was my Mary. My Belle was my Belle. My Florence was my Florence. And I want to have that for myself. So I thank you all. And there's my contact information. And I'm going to adjust my screen so that I can see all of your questions.
Thank you so much.
You are most welcome.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. I'm super inspired. So I'll go ahead and jump right into questions.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question, and you can hear me okay, huh, Gaynell? You just
yes, ma'am.
All right. So the first question is, did I understand this correctly, that you can look for specific people in 1950 census?
Well,
like the name and address.
Well, not yet. Well, you can find your own information. So, for example, my dad was born in 47. So I should be able to find my dad on the 1950 census when it comes out. If I want to look at it before then I have to go through some type of special request just to get access to his information only. Once the census is made available to the public, anyone can look at the records, but it's only in 2022 or when the census comes out. So with the pandemic, I'm not sure how everything is going to happen, but we'll see.
Thank you. Question. How did you know that the collection from Amistad Research Center, how did you know that it was there?
I didn't know. As a genealogist, as a family historian, we can't leave any stones unturned. And I promise you, this isn't something that happens overnight. I have been doing my family genealogy since 2007. And it's one of those things, one of those hobbies. It's an expensive hobby and it never stops. You are never done. And even with my Belle story, as I showed you guys, I'm still working on it. I'm still putting together pieces of her life, whether it be through DNA or just sharing her story. So I'm hoping that as I share her story, more and more people will come forward, because to my understanding, she had a huge impact on her community in the 12th ward. A lot of people knew her and worked with her and just loved her until she died and beyond in my case.
Next question, thank you. Is it complicated or expensive to access census records through Ancestry.com?
Not at all. You can start an account on Ancestry.com for free. You do have to pay for a monthly subscription. Excuse me, but even if you don't have the monthly subscription, your tree will always be there. Right now, if you're in Orleans Parish, the New Orleans Public Library, if you're a card member, you can actually search through Ancestry for free online through their site. It's one of those databases that I mentioned in the resource guide. Jefferson Parish Library, any of your local libraries, they pretty much have it where you could come into the library and research on Ancestry for free. Excuse me. Talking has dried my throat. You can also use FamilySearch.org. That's another place where you can get a copy of the census. And everything on FamilySearch.org is free. And that website is in there as well. But you can pull up copies of the military records, of any of the, and some of their stuff. They have also death certificates on FamilySearch.org. You just have to know how to find them. They have census records. In some cases, they have obituary and death information.
Okay, thank you. Next question. If that is true, this is going back to the 1950 census.
Mm-hmm.
If that is true about the 1950 census, would that be true for later census accounts? Am I breaking up? I'm sorry, am I breaking up again?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Oh, I was saying, the question is, if that is true about the 1950 census, would that be true for later census accounts?
Yes. And I think that's why it's so important for you to be counted. That's why I spent my last few days talking with people about the importance of completing the 2020 census. There has been cases where I have tried to find my ancestors on a certain decade, and I can't find them. And it's not that they weren't alive, I just can't find them. And I don't want that to be the case for you. I want when your grandkids come and find you on a 2020 census, I want them to be able to find you. So that's why it's so important to fill it out to the best of your knowledge, and be as truthful as you can. List any kids, list the grandkids, list everybody that's in the household. I found that on my dad's side, it was easier for me to research everything because, as Ashley mentioned, my family lived in Point Coupee Parish forever. They're still there. They're still in West Baton Rouge, so it's easier to research. Whereas you can tell on my mom's side, they moved around a lot. So that census document was so important for me to be able to track them and figure out when they were and where they were and what they were doing.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay. If you had particulars to begin searching with first, what would it be besides talking to a relative?
Honestly, that's the best way to go. If you can't talk to a relative, like say for example, you can't speak with anyone living who knows anything about that person, deal with the cemetery records, deal with the obituaries. And I need to say this because I forgot to mention this, because with my dad's side, although it was easier to find everything, it was more difficult to pull information out of him. And that's going to happen sometimes when we deal with our family history, right? If you're dealing with African-American history, it's painful. It's painful. That's the side of my family where I found a murder. So my grandfather changed his name. you're going to come across some things that make people uncomfortable. So sometimes you have to deal with death certificates and obituaries. And then when you find those documents, bring them back to the person you want to speak to if you can, and try to talk to them about it. You may get more information. I can't hear you.
Gaynell, where do you find the newspapers?
So with newspapers, you can find them. Genealogy Bank has them. Local libraries has access to them. If you are a New Orleans Parish Library card holder, they actually where you have it where you can search newspapers.com for free right now. There's actually 2 places on their online databases where you can actually search the newspaper. And not to mention, again, your public library in their particular area is the best source. So Genealogy Bank is fairly expensive, but you can search newspapers.com for free through the public library for right now.
Great. Thank you so much. What would be the thing that you've found during your research that you were most elated by?
Oh, I know one thing that I kind of laugh at it now. And she may be on here. I'm not sure if she's on here right now. Not really elated, but just I'm still processing it. So my husband and I, our families come from parishes that are far away, but we do share a cousin through one of his cousins. And I found out that my husband's cousin once, her family, her ancestors once owned my family. So I remember calling her one day, just picking on her, saying, hey, you owe me my reparations. And so she was just laughing so hard, just like, man, isn't it? Oh, she's here. She was laughing so hard at it. And it's simply because that's the twists and turns of African-American genealogy. My husband and I both share 2 cousins. And that's the thing that shocked me recently, was just to learn that, hey, so now we're cousins. The thing that got me most excited was learning that in spite of everything that I've heard about and read about slavery in the States, that I was able to find my family and be able to highlight the women in my family and their contributions, because I can't find my Belle in the book. When any reference to my Belle in the New Orleans textbook, I'm not going to find it. And it's up to me to share her story. And it's not just her, but just so many others like her. I remember this one lady I met at Jefferson Parish Library, and she's like, I'm so impressed because the way that you tell these stories, it can be anyone's grandmother that you're speaking about. And that's the thing that really inspires me, that really keeps me going. Like when I look at a photo of just beautiful women in Louisiana from the 1800s, I'm always looking at the woman in the background. My eyes have always been like mesmerized by them. I always want to know who were they and what did they do and where did they come from and what was their life like.
Great, thank you. Oftentimes, records around enslaved people only list a first name. How do you go about, how do you get past that roadblock in your research?
DNA. If you can, DNA. And then sometimes you can find some last names. They did travel, excuse me, they did travel when they were taking on the manifest. We had found some documents. My sister Yala and I were just talking about that, how you do see some surnames. They did take their surnames with them. In my family, I have, again, been fortunate because for the most part, up until the very early 1800s, my family lived in Louisiana.
But there are cases where I was just literally left with a name, and I'll leave it as such until DNA proves otherwise. This line that I was talking about, in which I'm related to my husband's cousin, was one of those cases where I didn't know anything about this family. And then it turns out through DNA, I was able to take that particular line in my family tree back to 1654. So it does happen. It does happen. So now I have to learn more about my Belgian roots. But it can happen. DNA is the key.
1654. Wow, that's amazing.
It does happen. So that's the line that I shared with my husband's cousin, all the way back to Point Capee, all the way to like some of the earlier settlers in the area. It just shows how long my family lived in Point Capee Parish.
Wow. How do you approach a situation where you're unable to find any records at all on someone?
They're out there. I remember one day I was sitting down and I was talking to Barbara Trevine, and she told me, because I had situations like that, I just had a name. She said, keep trying. When your ancestors know you're looking for them, they will help you find them. So you may not find it today, you may not find it tomorrow, but again, I have been working on this since 2007, and I just got that photo of my Belle 3 years ago. So it's gonna happen. Just keep looking. If you reach out, if it's for a particular parish, reach out to someone who's doing genealogy. That's when you join those historical societies in the areas and you start asking questions. That's when you visit the museum to try to understand a particular place. Your ancestor, was there. There's some proof that they lived. And that's why it's so important now to document your life. Take the time to start a journal article. Don't let Facebook be your journal. Sit down with some pen and paper and do it the old school way.
This has been so amazing, Gaynell. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for the audience. I'm so sorry about the technology issues that we've had today, and we really appreciate everyone's patience. Obviously, we'll be bringing Gaynell back again. She was exceptional, and we'd love to have her speak again. I'd also like to thank Whitney Plantation for being our co-host for today. They're an incredible institution that are reopening soon. So if you haven't, please go and visit them. Again, we're Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. We have 2 houses in the French Quarter, and we currently have a courtyard-only tour at Hermann-Grima should you want to be in the sunshine and safely explore a museum space. You'll be receiving an email from Zoom tomorrow with a survey. Please be kind in regards to technology, but you don't have to be. And in that email, you'll see a link to the resources that Gaynell has so kindly provided. So once again, thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a great evening. Bye.
Bye, everyone.